The most terrifying truth about evil isn't that monsters exist, it's that they're made from the same clay as saints, and you might be one decision away from becoming what you fear most. What if I told you that the capacity for both extraordinary good and unthinkable evil lives within every single person watching this right now? That the difference between a hero and a villain isn't written in their DNA, but carved by their choices, circumstances, and the invisible forces that shape our moral compass every single day? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most unsettling discoveries in human psychology. How ordinary people, good people, people just like you and me, can transform into the very monsters they once condemned. This isn't about pointing fingers or casting judgment. This is about understanding the psychology of evil so we can recognize it, resist it, and emerge stronger. Because when you understand how darkness spreads, you become immune to its infection. Stay with me, because what you're about to learn will forever change how you see yourself, your relationships, and the world around you. The greatest lie we tell ourselves is that evil people are fundamentally different from us. We comfort ourselves with the belief that monsters are born, not made, that wickedness flows through certain bloodlines like a genetic curse. This mythology serves our ego, protecting us from the uncomfortable truth that evil is not a permanent state of being but a temporary loss of moral direction that can happen to anyone under the right circumstances. Consider the ancient Stoic teaching of Epictetus, who spent years as a slave before becoming one of history's greatest philosophers. He understood that external circumstances don't determine our character, our responses do. Yet even he acknowledged that extreme situations can test the strongest moral foundations. When we encounter stories of good people doing terrible things, our immediate response is to distance ourselves, to declare that we would never succumb to such behavior. This psychological defense mechanism, known as the fundamental attribution error, blinds us to the situational forces that can corrupt even the most virtuous individuals. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned us that when we stare into the abyss stares back into us. He wasn't speaking metaphorically about literal monsters, but about the dangerous seduction of power, the gradual erosion of empathy, and the slow corruption that occurs when we justify small compromises in the name of greater goods. Every tyrant in history began as someone's beloved child, every corrupt leader once held noble ideals, and every person who has caused tremendous harm started their journey believing they were fundamentally good. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal that would become Meditations, constantly reminded himself to examine his own motivations and actions. He understood that the emperor's throne was not a pedestal of moral superiority but a position of tremendous temptation. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. It strips away the social constraints and consequences that normally keep our darker impulses in check, exposing the raw truth of who we are when no one is watching and nothing can stop us. The research reveals that ordinary individuals, when placed in extraordinary circumstances, can commit acts they never imagined possible. Prison guards become sadistic, neighbors become informants, and loving parents become enablers of atrocity. This isn't because they were secretly evil all along, but because they gradually adapted to environments that normalized and rewarded increasingly harmful behavior. The transformation happens so slowly, so subtly, that they never recognize the moment they crossed the line from protector to predator. Understanding this truth isn't meant to excuse evil behavior or diminish personal responsibility. Instead, it should terrify us into vigilance. If goodness isn't guaranteed by our past actions or current intentions, then maintaining our moral integrity requires constant attention, continuous self-examination, and the humility to recognize that we are all capable of becoming what we despise most. The environment shapes us more powerfully than we dare to admit. We like to believe that our character is an unshakable fortress, impervious to external pressures, but the truth is that we are constantly being molded by the situations we find ourselves in. The ancient Stoics understood this principle intimately, which is why Seneca spent so much time writing about the importance of choosing our companions and environments carefully. Aristotle taught us that we become what we repeatedly do, that excellence is not an act but a habit. But what he didn't emphasize enough is that our repeated actions are heavily influenced by the systems and structures surrounding us. When we place good people in bad systems, the systems win more often than we're comfortable. Acknowledging. The workplace that rewards ruthless competition over collaboration slowly transforms empathetic individuals into callous operators. The social group that normalizes gossip and backstabbing gradually erodes the moral boundaries of even the most principled members. Consider how authority structures can corrupt judgment and conscience. When someone in a position of power gives us permission to act in ways that contradict our values, we often comply, especially when that authority figure provides justification for our actions. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius was acutely aware of this danger, constantly questioning whether his decisions were driven by wisdom or by the intoxicating influence of unlimited power. He wrote extensively about the need to remain connected to his philosophical principles, even when surrounded by courtiers who would encourage and enable his worst impulses. The gradual nature of moral compromise makes it particularly insidious. We don't wake up one day and decide to become monsters. Instead, we make small concessions, justified by circumstances, that create a new baseline for acceptable behavior. The next compromise becomes easier, and the next one after that becomes routine. Before we realize what's happening, we're operating according to moral standards that would have horrified our former selves. This is why the Stoics emphasized the importance of daily self-reflection and regular examination of our principles and actions. Social proof, the psychological tendency to look to others for guidance on appropriate behavior, becomes dangerous in corrupted environments. When everyone around us is participating in questionable activities, our internal moral compass begins to wobble. We start to question whether our ethical standards are too rigid, whether we're being naive or overly idealistic. The pressure to conform, to fit in, to avoid conflict can slowly erode even the strongest moral foundations. The dehumanization of others is perhaps the most crucial situational factor in the transformation from good to evil. When we stop seeing certain people as fully human, when we reduce them to stereotypes, threats, or obstacles, we remove the empathetic barriers that normally prevent us from causing harm. This process often begins with language, subtle changes in how we refer to others that gradually strip away their humanity in our minds. The Stoics taught that all human beings share the same fundamental nature, that we are all part of the same cosmic community, and that recognizing this shared humanity is essential for maintaining our moral integrity. The transformation from good to evil rarely happens overnight. It's a slow burn, a gradual erosion that occurs so subtly that the person experiencing it often doesn't recognize the change until it's too late. This process mirrors what the ancient Greeks called akrasia, the weakness of will that causes us to act against our better judgment. But modern psychology reveals that this moral drift is often systematic and predictable, following patterns that we can learn to recognize and resist. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that we are not responsible for what happens to us, but we are completely responsible for how we respond to what happens to us. Yet even he acknowledged that repeated exposure to corrupting influences can wear down our resolve. When we're faced with the same moral dilemma repeatedly, when we're consistently pressured to compromise our values, when we're regularly rewarded for behavior that contradicts our principles, our moral boundaries begin to shift. What once seemed unthinkable becomes conceivable, then acceptable, then routine. This erosion often begins with self-justification. We tell ourselves stories about why this particular situation is different, why our usual moral standards don't apply, why we need to be practical rather than idealistic. These justifications serve as moral anesthesia, numbing our conscience to the pain of compromising our values. The more we practice this self-deception, the more skilled we become at it, until we can rationalize almost any behavior that serves our immediate interests. The role of incremental commitment cannot be overstated. When someone can convince us to take a small step in the wrong direction, they've made it easier for us to take the next step, and the one after that. This is why cult leaders don't ask new recruits to commit atrocities immediately. They start with small requests that seem reasonable, gradually escalating their demands as the person becomes more invested in the group. Each small compromise creates cognitive dissonance that can only be resolved by either admitting we were wrong or doubling down on our commitment to the corrupting path. Seneca wrote extensively about the importance of maintaining our philosophical principles in the face of adversity and temptation. He understood that moral character isn't tested in easy circumstances but in difficult ones, when maintaining our integrity requires sacrifice. The wealthy Stoic who never faces financial pressure hasn't proven their wisdom about money, just as the person who never encounters genuine temptation hasn't proven their moral strength. It's when the stakes are high, when the pressure is intense, when the consequences of doing the right thing are severe, that we discover who we truly are. The normalization of deviance is another crucial factor in moral erosion. When we're surrounded by people who are gradually lowering their standards, our own standards naturally drift downward to match the group. What would have shocked us a year ago barely registers today. What would have prompted us to speak up and object now passes without comment. This social contagion of moral compromise spreads through organizations, communities, and even entire societies, creating environments where good people can do terrible things while maintaining their self-image as decent individuals. The antidote to this gradual erosion is constant vigilance and regular recommitment to our core values. The Stoics practiced daily self-examination not because they were obsessed with perfection, but because they understood how easy it is to drift away from our principles without noticing. They knew that maintaining moral integrity requires the same kind of attention and effort that athletes put into maintaining physical fitness, consistent, deliberate practice that becomes a way of life. Power reveals character, but it also shapes it in ways that can be profoundly corrupting. The ancient wisdom that absolute power corrupts absolutely isn't just a political observation. It's a psychological truth about how authority changes the fundamental way we see ourselves and others. When we gain power over others, whether in our personal relationships, our professional environments, or our communities, we face temptations and challenges that can transform even the most well-intentioned individuals into the very people they once criticized. Marcus Aurelius, who held perhaps the greatest concentration of power in the ancient world as Roman emperor, was acutely aware of power's corrupting potential. His private journals reveal a man constantly battling against the ego inflation and moral blindness that authority can create. He repeatedly reminded himself that his position was temporary, that his power was meant to serve others rather than himself, and that he remained fundamentally equal to every other human being despite his elevated status. His philosophical discipline wasn't just personal development. It was a daily practice designed to prevent the corruption that destroys leaders and the people they're meant to serve. The psychological effects of power are immediate and measurable. Research shows that even minimal authority over others can reduce empathy, increase risk-taking behavior, and promote the objectification of subordinates. When we have the ability to control others' outcomes, their income, their opportunities, their social standing, we begin to see them less as fellow human beings and more as resources to be managed or obstacles to be overcome. This dehumanization isn't malicious. It's often unconscious, a byproduct of the cognitive changes that accompany positions of authority. Power also creates what psychologists call the illusion of control, the belief that we have more influence over outcomes than we actually do. This illusion feeds ego and reduces humility, making us less likely to seek advice, consider alternative perspectives, or acknowledge our mistakes. The Stoic emphasis on understanding what is and isn't within our control becomes crucial for anyone in a position of authority. Seneca, who served as advisor to Emperor Nero, understood firsthand how power can blind us to reality and lead us to make decisions based on wishful thinking rather than careful analysis. The isolation that often accompanies power compounds these psychological effects. As we rise in authority, we're increasingly surrounded by people who have incentives to tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to know. The honest feedback that helps maintain our moral compass becomes scarce, replaced by flattery and agreement that feeds our ego while starving our wisdom. This is why the Stoics valued friendship so highly. They understood that we need people in our lives who can speak truth to us regardless of our status or position. Perhaps most dangerous is how power can gradually shift our identity and self-concept. We begin to see ourselves as fundamentally different from others, as more deserving of privileges and less bound by the rules that govern ordinary people. This sense of entitlement grows slowly, justified by our responsibilities, our sacrifices, and our contributions. Before we recognize what's happening, we've developed a worldview in which our needs and desires naturally take precedence over those of others. The corruption of power isn't inevitable, but resisting it requires deliberate, sustained effort. It demands the kind of philosophical discipline that the Stoics practiced, the daily commitment to self-examination and principle that prevents us from drifting into moral blindness. It requires surrounding ourselves with people who will challenge us, maintaining connections with those who have no reason to flatter us, and regularly returning to the fundamental values that should guide our decisions regardless of our circumstances or authority. The most hopeful truth about the psychology of evil is that the same forces that can corrupt us can also be harnessed for good. If situations can turn saints into sinners, then carefully chosen environments and deliberately cultivated habits can help us maintain and strengthen our moral character. The path back to integrity, or the path that prevents us from losing it in the first place, requires understanding not just how people fall into darkness but how they can consistently choose to walk toward the light. The Stoic practice of self-examination provides the foundation for moral vigilance. Just as a physician must diagnose an illness before treating it, we must honestly assess our current moral state before we can improve it. This requires the courage to look at our motivations, our actions, and our rationalizations without the comfortable filter of self-deception. Seneca wrote about the importance of ending each day by reviewing our actions and decisions, not to torment ourselves with guilt but to learn from our mistakes and recommit to our principles. This daily practice of moral inventory prevents the gradual drift that leads good people into evil territory. Creating accountability structures becomes crucial for maintaining integrity, especially when we hold positions of power or influence. The Stoics understood that wisdom comes from community, that we need others to help us see our blind spots and challenge our assumptions. This might mean finding mentors who can provide honest feedback, joining groups that share our values, or simply maintaining relationships with people who knew us before we gained authority or status. These connections serve as moral anchors, reminding us of who we are beneath our roles and responsibilities. The cultivation of empathy serves as perhaps our strongest defense against moral corruption. When we genuinely see others as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect, it becomes much harder to justify harming them for our own benefit. The Stoics taught that all humans are part of the same cosmic community, that we are naturally designed to work together for the common good. This isn't naive idealism, it's practical wisdom about how to maintain